science so fast. Never we had to learn a disease so fast that we've had to do through this COVID pandemic. The talks that we were taking, the concepts that we were speaking of in first wave evolved and changed substantially during the second wave. Further, different parts of the country are in different stages of the wave, so are facing different problems. I understand that while majority of our attendees today will be from Delhi, but we are joined by delegates outside Delhi also. So, Maharashtra was 2-3 weeks ahead of us, and then Delhi and North India came, and then South India further 2-3 weeks apart. So, 5-6 weeks after the peak of the endemic, we are facing some very peculiar entities and very peculiar diseases which we have not been able to explain fully. So I'm going to show you some stuff which we understand and some stuff which we don't understand. And there's another very big part of this, which is respiratory co-infections. So today when I talk of mucor, I'm only going to talk about sinonasal mucor, and I removed the respiratory co-infections because ICRI or IRI is holding a one-day seminar on the 12th. That's a week away. So I'm going to do respiratory co-infections at that time. So I'm not going to touch pulmonary mucor today, and I will be dealing with all respiratory co-infections and how do you differentiate them from COVID during that talk. So that talk will be like a continuum of this talk. Now in the lung part, I'm going to try and understand and explain that why does the CT score not always match with the clinical picture? So what is additional beyond CT score that we need to look at? Can we predict reversibility? And the fact that you're doing HRCTs most of the time, but yet in the same breath saying that pulmonary vascular disease is a very important complication of COVID-19 pneumonia. So detecting these vascular complications and other complications such as infections on an NCCT is also a challenge. And half the time, if you don't suspect it, you may not go for a subsequent CTPA. And then I'm going to speak about something which I have called myself as a late inflammatory syndrome because I don't know what to call it. I didn't find any literature on it, but we are currently kind of flooded with admissions, not flooded like we were with active COVID pneumonia, but we have a lot of unexplained admissions with a diseased entity, which I will show you. So to first try and explain that why does the COVID-19 score not match? What is more to that score? So that score actually is a very robust method, but it kind of deals with how much of the lung is involved. Whether you use a 25 score and describe it in terms of lobes, or you use a 40 score, and describe it in terms of bronchopulmonary segments. There are several other automated and non-automated methods which basically differentiate aerated lung from a non-aerated lung. So the volume of an aerated lung kind of determining that what the outcome of the patient will be. But then we have all seen that patient with excess of 20 score will be roaming around and eventually come out, and then those with much lower scores will pass away. So we need to understand that what are the factors which could be responsible. Most important amongst these, of course, remains the host factors, including age and comorbidities. By now, everybody is familiar with this diagram, that what happens in stage 1, 2, and 3, which is the viral phase and the host inflammatory phase. And as I said, that this entire phase, talks only about 2 and 3 weeks of the illness, but we are in week 5 and 6 of the pandemic or beyond. And this doesn't seem to be ending. So from a lung point of view, the entire story actually comes in the pulmonary phase, which is starts during the second week and peaks. If you see the peak, then it will peak at one time, the lung involvement, and then start to come down. The peak will be somewhere in the second half of that week 2. There are various stages people have described. You're all familiar by now. Up to 7 stages of what this pneumonia passes through have been described. and not everybody passes through these stages. And obviously, unlike the beginning of the pandemic, nobody does all CTs to simply document what is happening. But just to understand, we will go into the path of this. So basically, I'm going to talk today more about pathology and then explain what we see on radiology. So it's like a radio path session. This slide has one change which I want to show you before the core path article start. So when we see the ground glass, which is the early stage, it says that there is congestion of alveolar capillaries and resulting in some edema. Edema which fills up the alveolar spaces, and edema which swells up the interlobular septa. In either case, you're going to get ground glass opacities because ground glass opacities can result from both of these phenomena. Now, how do we decode pathology and understand the radio path of what is going on? See, unfortunately, most of the path articles are understandably only postmortem articles because nobody is doing biopsies on live patients because the diagnosis is obvious to you. So whatever knowledge we have gained and then extrapolated onto our CT scanners is from postmortem studies. So this is a postmortem study from Italy, somewhat in the beginning of the pandemic in June when they were at their first wave, and on about 38 patients. And I will show you the path of this and explain. See what they said, that people who die, at least the most important pathological change that happens is the DAD, or the diffuse alveolar damage. So if DAD rings a bell, where did we hear of DAD before? DAD is the pathology correlate of ARDS. So when you talk about a clinical radiological syndrome, the term is ARDS. And what is the path correlate of this clinical radiological symptom? The path correlate is DAD. So the two terms are many times used interchangeably. And where does the virus actually go and lodge itself? The virus is located in the type 2 pneumocytes. And then we have a lot of some things which are happening in the form of thrombi. So let's just look at and then the slides on how the stages move, and you'll understand how the radiology will move. So what happens in the early phase of DAD is again now rings a bell and takes you down to hyaline membrane disease of the children, that basically you get a hyaline membrane. So these air spaces are the alveoli which will get lined by hyaline membrane, which is the first stage. Along with this, as this evolves, you tend to have what happens within the small blood vessels, which is presence of microthrombi. So microthrombi within the peripheral blood vessels is a very important component of this disease entity. Then it turns into a diffuse interstitial pneumonia where you see the inflammatory cells, predominantly lymphocytes, which will fill up all the interlobular septae. And as you can compare the hyaline membrane stage, all the alveolus also got filled. It goes into a more organizing phase over a period of time, early proliferative phase, what it is called. Then further organizing, it's called the intermediate proliferative phase. And lastly is the advanced proliferative phase. And this is the phase, that I speak about when we discuss post-COVID. Today, we are not discussing post-COVID because I said we'll discuss current wave issues. And then when we are past this, we'll again revisit our knowledge of post-COVID. So what is characteristic of this advanced stage is the myofibroblastic reaction. There is a burst and a recruitment of myofibroblasts which lead to fibrosis. So this, clinical significance of this we will discuss when we do post-COVID. I really tried to search that is there anybody who has any histopathology available on live patients, and all that I found were two people on whom lung resections were done because of early adenocarcinoma, and patients simultaneously also tested positive for COVID-19 pneumonia. And they reported what I showed you in the beginning, that before the DAD sets in, what you get is just edema, some proteinaceous exudate, but always a hyperplasia of the type 2 pneumocytes because that's where the virus is sitting, and cellular infiltration, and the hyaline membranes have yet not appeared. So that appears when the DAD part of this sets in. Now, this is the radiology of those two cases of this case report. And this is what they showed when they found on pathology, edema, proteinaceous exudate, that phase. This is what it looked like to you, which means that there was ground glass and there was some amount of denser consolidation. And what is this? The early DAD phase, which we would have labeled it as a crazy paving. So when I go on subsequently, I'll tell you where the crazy paving fits into this progression story. So, but crazy paving implies that DAD has already set in. Now, this is another this thing of the term organizing pneumonia. So who said that on radiology, we talk about OP patterns. So how do we know that COVID-19 causes organizing pneumonia? So radiology has been reporting this pattern, but again, I did find at least one case report which spoke about showing organizing pneumonia pattern on the pathology. And as you know, that organizing pneumonia not only causes subpleural consolidations and ground glass, it causes peribronchovascular consolidation, and it causes a new pattern which has been spoken about in the last few years, which is called the perilobular pattern. So this is the perilobular pattern of OP, and the other signs of OP such as ATOL, etc. we'll see in the cases as we go along. And do notice that whenever there is like ground glass or consolidation, there are these prominent vessels. Always there are prominent vessels. So those microthrombi and prominent vessels are the nemesis of this disease actually, but also give a signature to us, which is proving immensely useful. I'll tell you how as we go along. So in radiopath correlation, how does this translate into imaging appearance? To just briefly run through what we have already seen, that the patient is infected with SARS-CoV-2. After it rests in the nasopharynx for some time, it comes down. It causes an inflammation of bronchial and alveolar mucus, sets off a cellular and humoral immunity. Everybody's familiar with this humoral immunity because everybody is getting their antibodies tested every few weeks now, IgG, IgM. But remember that an important part of this immunity is also cellular immunity, which is going to kick in later. And this immune response results in a hyperimmune response. So when we have a hyperimmune response, we get the cytokine storm, which brings on the peak of the lung changes, and it causes an organizing pneumonia type pattern. It causes, fibrin, it causes closure of the capillary endothelial cells, thrombosis. And I said eventually recruitment of fibroblasts, and all of this is contributing to a impaired oxygen exchange, which leads to the drop in SpO2 levels that you see. Now, this is another one which is also a postmortem study, but it has documented progression. That it's not that they had progression in the same patient, but they saw the path and then they went back to see the CT or radiographs of the patient that were available. So whatever picture I showed you on DAD is now going to show that what does that picture look like on radiology. So see, when DAD has already set in at this stage, what do you get on radiology? You get a diffuse ground glass opacity. So I am going to speak about types of ground glass opacities shortly, but I will for this moment call this as a diffuse pattern. Yeah, you get this in the early DAD. When we come to mid-phase, then you start getting septal thickening. You start getting some areas which are dense consolidation and with a apicobasal and dorsoventral gradient, which means that it's more in the bases and more in the posterior parts of the lung, as happens in any ARDS. In the late organizing phase, you can see the special stain for fibroblasts and you can see the brown stain. So, to us, this is ground glass with some septal thickening and then this large areas of mass-like consolidation, but what the pathologist is getting by now is already fibroblasts. And eventually this stage starts to get a air-filled spaces, which are this micro honeycombing. So very fast in the initial third week, by late second week to third week, you will start to get these micro honeycombing pattern. So to understand that when we see this on radiology, what does it mean on pathology? So remember, I'm talking about all postmortem studies where they got biopsies. There will be some people who will not reach that stage and then revert back from the first stage that I've been speaking about here. So if you see a normal CT, it can still mean an early phase of DAD. Yeah, so people with early phase DAD had either GGO or they had a normal CT. Okay, if you see ground glass, it can mean any of this phase. So what happens is that ground glass is seen throughout all the phases of DAD, and every ground glass hence does not reflect an early disease and does not reflect a reversible disease. And when we see ground glass, we'll say that can we make out this reversible versus irreversible ground glass. When we see a crazy paving pattern, it implies that we are at least already into a mid phase of DAD. So presence of crazy paving means we have reached the proliferative stage, as does the presence of consolidation. So both of them kind of have a similar connotation, except that in the late phase, only consolidation is present and even crazy paving doesn't come. And eventually you will get micro honeycombing, as I said, as part of the late phase. Now, another study, which saw CT findings by duration of symptoms, and I have put these day-wise labels on it to just say what's the classical description which you tend to see: 4 days, 8 days, 12 days, 18 days, denser consolidation, 26 days, distinct fibrotic bands, 38 days, it's almost looking like a round atelectasis, and the subpleural lines, which everybody is very familiar with. And throughout this story, when you are still able to see the vessels before it goes into the consolidation phase, do notice the prominent vessels. Yeah, when you compare it with the other side, they're always larger. And that's a very useful sign. Sorry. Yeah. So what happens is that if you collate the CT scores, just to go back to why the CT score will not always correlate with symptom and progression, is if you see the CT scores in the initial part, yes, when it peaks, it goes from stage 1 to 3 to 4, it reaches a certain level, it is increasing, but you see, it never decreases back to come back to what it started with. This kind of tends to persist for a long time. And once you reach a certain peak, it's going to come down a little, but it's not going to come down to normal or even to stage 1. So that is why I'm introducing the concept of a CT morphology score. So there are many centers who have been using a CT morphology score, even if you don't, use a formal score, but just to say that the importance of reflecting the morphology in addition to the extent. So now I go back to that, what that main table was trying to show, that what does it mean if I see ground glass opacity? So, I kind of label this ground glass as the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there is a good ground glass, there's a bad ground glass, and there's an ugly ground glass. So the good ground glass is when you see it like this, when you see multifocal or even the classical peripheral subpleural. And a lot of this is going to revert back. Some of it will revert back, but if the patient goes into a cytokine storm and the inflammatory markers go up, then it will go on and progress to an OP pattern or to a DAD pattern. So let's see one patient. This is again a classical peripheral that you're familiar with. Some early septal thickening already begin to show. Where would you put this ground glass? So somewhere in the middle. It's not as good as this, may not fully reverse, but somewhere in the bad ground glass. And then what is the ugly ground glass we'll come to. Firstly, I'm talking about diagnostic signs, as I've always been speaking through the first wave also, that it's not that we are using CT to diagnose COVID pneumonia, at least most of the time. We will use it in several special situations, but not most of the time. Then why so much emphasis on this diagnostic signs? I'll show you why it is important to know the diagnostic signs of COVID-19 pneumonia. So 82-year-old male who had non-specific symptoms and was a smoker. And, beginning of first wave, when we were not that familiar with the COVID-19. So what do we get? We got some cystic spaces in the subpleural areas. We also got cystic spaces through these areas of ground glass. We got centrilobular emphysema. Everything was very asymmetric. And then when we came down, we got And patient was, I think, at around 4th or 5th day of illness. We have ground glass. We already have cystic spaces. We already have some septal thickening. And I knew the long-standing history of this patient. So I'm going to tell you. So patient is a smoker with a smoking index of more than 600. Patient has a kind of a CPFE pattern, in the sense patient has upper lobe emphysema and has had this septal thickening and this small amount of peripheral honeycombing for years. He was about 10-15 years on our follow-up, but all this ground glass was new, and patient denied any respiratory symptoms. So what is the entity we want to differentiate this from? So you don't know whether it's only a DIP in a patient who claims to have no respiratory symptoms, but now we are wiser and we know all this is COVID-19 pneumonia, and patient came out to be RT-PCR positive. So what are the signs which could have helped you? Because in this case of peripheral subpleural distribution, patient already has an early UIP. So that is why you are getting those changes. And we are facing the same problem when patients have CTD ILD, patients of systemic sclerosis, that whether to take a call of NSIP or whether to take a call of COVID-19 pneumonia. So this patient had both. So patient had a background of ILD and then had this superadded COVID-19 pneumonia. So that's when, we use the VES signs, as they are called. I'm not showing all the signs today. You must have heard of target sign, gingo leaf sign, and all the signs that I've been showing you all along. And I will talk about the importance of this sign when I do respiratory co-infections next week, because, I have found this very useful when this fungus has erupted on us. I'm getting target sign on so many people, and it's such a call to take of aspergillosis versus COVID-19 pneumonia, which again comes down to, steroids versus no steroids. And one sign that has been, holding steady and never let us down is the center fat vessel. So the center fat vessel is a very useful sign to say, yes, amongst these area of ground glass, this is likely to be a COVID-19 pneumonia. Crazy paving, I told you, by the time you get the crazy paving, you're already in mid phase, and distributions don't matter. This one has upper lobe predominance. I'm sure all of you have seen a whole lot of distributions, upper lobe, mid zone, asymmetric, but this is crazy paving, which means that we are in the mid phase of DAD, which means that all of this is not going to entirely reverse. So now I'm going to run through 3-4 corneal spots.
This meeting is being recorded.
What I want you to notice is the difference between the right lung and the left lung. And then I'm going to talk about, the importance of NCCT, although this is a CTPA, so I'll tell you why. What do you notice?
The recording has stopped.
What do you notice in the two sides? One, throughout that you see, the right side has somewhat diminished volume, and the right side also has a paucity of vessels. And what we did find in this patient in the CTPA are numerous. We had done a new CTPA because there was a raised D-dimer and patient's saturation had fallen. Numerous microthrombi which were present throughout. All these dilated vessels corresponded to segmental thrombi. And why I'm showing an NCCT with, without showing fancy perfusion scans which are available for the patient. The point is that most of us are not doing upfront CTPAs, everybody does, but the importance of recognizing this difference in the density on vessels on the two sides is important in the NCCT itself, because that will point to a presence of microthrombi. Patient also had a superadded bacterial infection in this case. I'm not going into full pulmonary vascular disease, as I said, focusing on some areas in different talks. So today I'm focusing on the lung. Now, this is what was meant by what you mean by GGO. And yeah, this is what I mean by the ugly GGO. So this is the ugly GGO, which is not going to revert. What is the ugly GGO? It's a very diffuse GGO. You don't see the multifocal consolidate pattern. You don't see the subpleural pattern. You see a diffuse GGO with several areas showing you this paucity of vessels instead of dilated vessels, and several areas which may be showing you bronchial dilatation. And we lost this patient about 3 days after this CT. and patient went into overt right-sided heart failure. Now we come to what does consolidation mean in COVID-19 pneumonia. So throughout so far, GGO, good, bad, or ugly, has had various implications in terms of reversibility and prognosis, but it still means that it's COVID-19 pneumonia. Yeah. But when we come to consolidation, we could either be dealing with COVID pneumonia, which is that OP phase or DAD phase, like this patient was, OP pneumonia phase, or we could be dealing with bacterial pneumonia or an infarct. So as I said, when you see consolidation like this, it becomes an issue. You do need to take a call that will you call it a DAD or will you call it a consolidation? And when we see DAD, I think I have a more advanced DAD. I will tell you why this was labeled as bacterial pneumonia. Basically, one point is the asymmetry and any level of cavitation, pleural effusion. Not that you can't get pneumatoceles in COVID-19. You can get pneumatoceles in COVID-19, but overt thick-walled cavities and associated unilateral pleural effusion with an unilateral consolidation kind of points to a infection, mostly bacteria or fungus. So this is that. Do keep in mind that a consolidation, especially if it is large in a certain area, can mean these two things. So I'll show you an example of a peripheral consolidation. So this is a 20-year-old boy who underwent a CT scan during home isolation for some shortness of breath and primarily raised D dimers. And he had this consolidation. So, patient was maintaining saturation. He was very young and there was no overt breathlessness. We found it difficult to take a call that, but we did think that this is very asymmetric. It's in one lobe. So we should take a call of bacterial pneumonia versus an infarct. Nothing was fitting into bacterial pneumonia clinically. I tried to look for signs. There are signs like a truncated vessel sign. So what happens is that what I'm repeatedly emphasizing is that during the COVID-19 pneumonia, in the area of ground glass, you will see dilated vessels. And what's the classical truncated vessel sign of an infarct is that the vessels falls short of that area. Yeah. And you may even get a triangular opacity like this. But when this ground glass has evolved into a consolidation and gets very dense and obscures the underlying vessel, it becomes a difficult call. And in several areas, we could see, areas of dilated vessels also. So we kind of said that, no, if your D dimer continues to be high, you should perhaps undergo a CTPA. Patient continued to remain fine and did not undergo a CTPA. All the inflammatory markers came down and then developed a left-sided pleuritic pain after about 10 days. And then when I saw this, again, an NCCT, that was the second CT he was carrying, patient had developed a mild left pleural effusion, and we repeated the advice that a CTPA should be done. And what it showed was a chronic thrombus on the left side and, right side, where the original consolidation had come. And we were beginning to get segmental thrombi on this left side also, which accounted for, not brought all MIP images, so small segmental vessels. You see, there is a dilated vessel and then you lose it. So we had segmental thrombi on the left side. And if you see that there is a mild dilatation of the MPA by now, what is the implication of whether I say that segmental thrombi are present or not present? The postmortem studies, which I showed you, a very similar study came out to the Italian study, came out of AIIMS about 4 to 5 months after that initial Italian study, which reported similar findings. The only difference that we reported was that we did not see the microthrombi, which were reported in the Italian study. And why did we not see the microthrombi? Because then everyone had red flagged this aspect, and everyone was receiving prophylactic anticoagulation. And now, of course, during the second wave, people have been receiving this prophylactic anticoagulation at home. But in this child means 20-year-old young boy, we had to take a decision to move from prophylactic anticoagulation doses to therapeutic anticoagulation doses. So that is why it's important to recognize whether there are even segmental thrombi or infarcts, because then we will move on to the therapeutic doses of anticoagulation rather than the prophylactic doses. So consolidation can also represent an OP pattern. We already discussed an ATOL sign. So as I said that we will reserve post-COVID sequelae, post-COVID fibrosis for another day because it's a big topic by itself, and I will talk about it once we are post what is going on right now. So yes, only point to note is that bronchial ectasis by now reflects an irreversible disease most likely, but when you see it in those DAD phases and when you see it in that subpleural line phases, we have seen that over a period of time, as the inflammation settles, so does the bronchial dilatation. And why does it settle? Because that bronchial dilatation is due to the pull of the surrounding inflammation and not due to irreversible damage to the bronchial wall. Irreversible damage to the bronchial wall is an intrinsic part of the definition of bronchiectasis. So talking about reversibility, I've already said how some things will be reversible and some things will not be reversible. What I have seen is that if the patient does not pass away with DAD, does not pass away because of very dense consolidation, the areas of consolidation do tend to become fainter. But you see, as the patient has improved over a time, what has happened? Patient had this milky looking ground glass. This ground glass is also dangerous. All of this eventually led to septal thickening. All of this leads to bronchial dilatation. You see bronchial dilatation everywhere. So there is a tendency many times for the disease to move from the peripheries across to involve the entire lung. So it begins more in the periphery, but as it goes on, you will see that over a period of time, it involves the entire lung. And what about apicobasal gradient? So as the DAD moves, definitely like all ARDS, you have a predominance for the posterior lung and you have a predominance for the lower lobe. See, this is the bronchial dilatation of the DAD. It could have gone either way, and which way did it go? It did lead eventually to some bronchiectasis. So it does lead to some bronchiectasis, some pneumatoceles came out of the cavitation. So this was a plain COVID pneumonia with no superadded infection. Now the big debate in the use of antifibrotics, which people have adopted, given up, some are still adopting. The whole debate has been that how early does that myofibroblastic reaction come in? And although we know that antifibrotics will take 2 to 3 weeks at least for their effect to kick in, but still, when a treating clinician's back is pushed against the wall, they will tend to introduce antifibrotics into the second, third week of illness, especially in patients with severe DAD. So, this pattern of crazy paving was when I spoke about, and as you go down in this patient, and this pattern of dense consolidation with septal thickening is the point where they say maximum myofibroblasts come, and is the type of lung in which everybody is using antifibrotics, but they will actually help only if the patient manages to survive the acute phase of this illness and is unlikely to be helpful during the acute phase. And so we are working on, not a complicated score from a research point of view, but from a report point of view, we try to keep this simple and just add a morphology score, at least to reflect in the report that how much is pure GGU, how much is crazy paving, and how much is consolidation. It gives us an idea of prognosticating, and it gives us an idea when we follow. And additional opacities such as presence of septal thickening or bronchial ectasis and dilatation or OP areas, we simply mention as present or not present. And lastly, in the lung part, I'm going to tell you a phenomenon that we do not understand, but we have even in the main hospital being currently at least 15 patients admitted with this syndrome, which we are choosing to call late inflammatory syndrome, but we are not sure what it is. Actually, it is similar to the MIS-C of children, except that in MIS-C of children, it's a multi-system disorder. And in the adult, the hit is again taken by the lung and not by the other organ systems, as is happening in children. So the only article which I could find to explain this phenomenon, everybody is talking about autoimmune and inflammatory diseases following COVID-19. A lot of you who would have had COVID-19 also would have seen that you are suffering from musculoskeletal symptoms such as tenosynovitis and tendinitis, following a few weeks of the illness, starting about third or fourth week of the illness, which is part of this autoimmune and inflammatory disease phenomenon which we are facing. But I'm going to tell you what we are facing in the lung, and where as I told you that I'm finding the target sign very useful. So this is patient in first week of April when patient got COVID-19 pneumonia. And this is patient now. Yeah, so patient came to us 6 weeks. Last tested about 2 weeks back was RT-PCR negative. And I'll show you one more image. See, there are 3 CTs. So I got to see this CT about 36 hours before this one. This is only at a 36 hours interval. But on that CT also, they asked me, patient has just been running fever for a couple of days. What do you think? So I thought most of it is post-COVID, and maybe, you know, when you see it on a PAC station, like somehow I was not comfortable about this lung. As I told you, I'm very sensitive about the good and the bad and the ugly, Gijo. I said something new has happened here. And since we are talking about co-infections, I'm not sure that if it's an influenza co-infection, is it a COVID reinfection? They said, is it MIS or cytokine storm? I said, 6 weeks into the disease. Although during the first wave also we had encountered this patients coming in about third or fourth week. We had a couple of admissions like this, but patient saturation dropped. They said, let's do a CTPA fast because we need to know why the saturation has suddenly dropped, because then the patient will become too unfit to move. And this is what happens. We managed to do a CTPA. There was no thrombus either in the large or the segmental vessels. And after that, we have not been able to shift the patient down. And we went into a florid ARDS picture. I called it an AIP. It's not by definition of ARDS because ARDS requires a PaO2, SiO2, SpO2 ratio less than 100 to label it as ARDS. But patient developed this AIP injury, and then tested RT-PCR positive. 15 days back, patient was RT-PCR negative, now tested positive. We had to take a call, methylpred or withhold methylpred and give remdesivir again, or use the monoclonal antibody cocktail. And we took a call. We waited for the inflammatory markers. The inflammatory markers were again going through the roof, and we took a call towards an inflammatory syndrome because I was confident that if it's not influenza, there is no other co-infection. And we have treated the patient for the last few days with methylpred 125 initially, and now we have brought down the IV steroids, but still on IV steroids. We have not achieved a reversal, but we have only achieved a stabilization with only marginal decrease in the oxygen requirement. Patient is still on HFNC of about 15 liters. So this is what we are calling the late inflammatory syndrome, and we are increasingly having admissions now with new respiratory symptoms. Most of them are RT-PCR negative, but most of them are having a second peaking of the inflammatory biomarkers. And as you know, that if it happens in children, then you have to look out for the heart. And even in them, we are monitoring for myocarditis, and we are monitoring for systemic involvement. The other big thing which is happening at 6 weeks, of course, is the co-infections. And I'm going to speak on only one such co-infection today, which is the COVID-associated mucormycosis, because as I told you, I will speak about the respiratory co-infections and how to make them out from this late inflammatory peak and post-COVID sequelae in my talk on 12th. So today I will only speak about COVID-associated mucormycosis. I'll do this back to back, and then I'll take the questions at one time. Everybody is talking about this, whether my son is writing law entrance or somebody puts on media, and everybody's about the black fungus, and should you be talking about the black fungus? How big are these numbers? Depending on the city that you are reporting in, whatever friends have been sharing from different parts of India, not to label any particular part, but the numbers are huge, huge in several cities. For us, I would say moderate. We have had in excess of 150 admissions, and our head and neck surgeons are operating round the clock on every holiday, on every Sunday, because you know that sinonasal mucormycosis has to be operated. So in this wave, we have seen that sinonasal mucor is far more common than pulmonary mucormycosis during this wave. And it has also emerged as the most dominant fungus infection if you were to consider Aspergillus and other species, including Candida. There are several terms which I use, but the two terms are, one is a kappa, which I will talk about again next time, as I told you, because this is pulmonary kappa, and one is the CAM. CAM means COVID-associated mucormycosis. To go into what CAM will look like, we have to just briefly touch the terminology of rhinosinusitis. So rhinosinusitis can be acute, it can be chronic when it's called CRS. This implies that there is no polyposis. If it is CRS associated with polyposis, then we use this term CRS-WP, which means CRS with polyposis. You can have allergic fungal sinusitis, and you can have invasive fungal sinusitis, which is what we are talking about. And by definition, the term invasive is used when there is invasion of bone and vessel, on bone or vessel, or both on histopathology. The short forms used are IFS or AIFR, and these two are the common species, Aspergillus and Zygomycetes. And another term which is used is ROCM, which is rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. And you can also have a mycetoma as form of fungal infections. Believe me, people with sinonasal symptoms are coming with all of these phases, because everybody who has a sinonasal symptom now is getting a CT done, and it is our job to differentiate whether it is a pre-existing disease which does not need a panic reaction, or it is an invasive fungal sinusitis. The cultured fungal pathogens in an older article, so before COVID era, in any invasive fungal sinusitis besides Aspergillus and mucor, Fusarium is one that we have also encountered in our cultures several times. The others we have not really encountered frequently. Now, mucormycosis in the paranasal sinuses, there are two terms which you will see used. ROCM, which has a worse prognosis because it involves the orbit and CNS, and the rhinomaxillary form, which involves the nasal mucosa and the maxillary sinus, and has yet not gone into the orbit or the intracranial. See, if you will not treat rhinomaxillary form aggressively, then what will happen? It will move to ROCM, and you will lose the vision. If you not, means it will move to the orbit. If you will not treat the orbit aggressively with exenteration and antifungals, what will happen? It will move to the intracranium, and that's when the mortality gets really high. Once it reaches the intracranial, there is a part of the disease which we cannot remove completely at surgery, so the mortality gets really high. So we have to diagnose this to prevent the patient from losing vision, and we have to diagnose the orbital to prevent the patient from losing life. I found when I was researching for this talk an immensely useful article. It's actually an editorial. It's written as an editorial in the current issue of Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. So it's a free document, but it's an excellent guideline statement. And my entire talk is framed around that guideline statement because it put a lot of radiology that we were seeing into perspective. So I am going to follow the outline of these guidelines in this talk. So what are the warning symptoms? What are the first symptoms that come? As I said, it begins with nasal stuffiness, foul smell, discharge, including epistaxis. See, we've had patients, including doctors, who are walking into the ER with Escher in their hands. And in this regard, I would just like to say one thing, that there is a school of thought now that, besides diabetes, steroids, what are the risk factors? I'll just come to that one second. Let me just finish the symptoms. So symptoms of the nose and paranasal sinuses, then the lid edema comes, the orbital pain comes, the loss of vision comes, the paresthesias come, and eventually once the intracranial disease comes, then you get the paralysis, cranial nerve deficits, focal seizures, etc. And this is the worst case scenario. This is not a CAM. This is pre-COVID-19 era article, which says challenges in a rural setting. And currently it's a challenge that everybody is facing, because people in every sort of setting are having to treat this disease. And this is the argument as to people saying that we have used steroids for years or for various illnesses. Why has CAM erupted on us only now? There are various factors, and one or two I will touch upon the basic pathophysiology when we see the MR images. But just to see the obvious factors, one is there is no doubt that the overuse and early use of corticosteroids is contributing. How? Because basically, it throws off the diabetics sugar control totally out of gear, corticosteroids, and the insulin monitoring and all is not very rigid in several places. And, using them very early on in the disease, which has been a big public health problem. Tocilizumab is also adding to it. HFNC is adding to it. See, everything which is abrading the nasal and paranasal sinus, and actually from lung point of view, even the lung alveolar lining. So HFNC, even, we are not using ventilation mostly, but even high flow nasal cannula will eventually cause abrasion of the mucosa. See, this is the important point which I wanted to bring out to everybody. When I also got some upper UI symptoms with fever, with the presumed COVID, everybody said, do steam, which was correct. Like, it's okay, you do. But now what is felt is that this huge amount of steaming and this huge amount of nasal lavaging, everybody is putting something into their nose that we have been doing, has also contributed to damaging our nasal mucosa. So, in a person who has good immunity, it's not going to matter. But if you have diabetes and if you have been on steroids, all these measures kind of, increase the likelihood of your getting mucor. So you get mucor because you see spores are in the environment, more in certain environment, like if you're a farmer or in moldy walls. So spore goes into most of nasal mucosa, but most people will be able to handle it. But if you have an abraded mucosa or you have diabetes and you are on corticosteroids, it's not going to have handle. And the spore will change to its hyphal form. Now it is the hyphal form which is going to create havoc. But also important to remember from educating your patient's point of view, hyphal form is not transmitted from patient to patient or person to person. So no mucormycosis patient is infectious to us. So no healthcare worker or a co-patient needs to be alarmed on that score. A hyphal form is not transmitted from person to person. Only the spores are transmitted. And then your immunity determines that whether you get mucormycosis or not. And of course, mask. And there are indications where you should, posaconazole is now being used prophylactically extensively, such as if 3 weeks of mechanical ventilation, supplemental oxygen, or systemic corticosteroids have been on. And with or without diabetes in the ICUs, oral posaconazole is being started as a prophylaxis. So I am sorry, but I am going to cover some clinical and microbiology in this, including the management, because otherwise we do not get a perspective on the imaging that we are doing. So you will hear everybody talking about aseptate hyphae, because when we see septate hyphae in the same setting, we tend to think of the Aspergillus species. So what is the diagnostic technique? I continue to say that unless otherwise specified, all these images are credited to the same article of IGO. So on direct microscopy is done, which is the quickest way. Besides KOH, the other mount which is used is a calcofluor white. And as you can see, this is a aseptate. You don't see many branching hyphae. And even if you see, there will be very few, what is called non-septate or posiseptate fungi. And then when you do culture, this is known as SBD. The common term you will be seeing used in reports which you get of patient are SBD. It will also specify that with gentamicin or with chloramphenicol. Most of the reports I've seen in Delhi say SBD with chloramphenicol. Yeah, so this is this is from the case report of that rural setting. And this is what it will look like on an SBD medium. Fluffy black pores like this. So this is what it describes, that you will get a fluffy, cottony type of growth. And see, on a higher microscopy, when you see, this is called a rhizopore. This is the rhizopore, which will eventually, this rhizoid will go to form a spore, which from the patient goes into the environment, dries, and then goes from, which can spread through the inhalation. So molecular diagnostics, unlike the COVID-19 on which we have been depending so much on RT-PCR, and we have serum galactomannan for aspergillus. Unfortunately, we do not have any molecular diagnostics for mucormycosis, but we have histopath and we have, direct microscopy and culture. Now, you see, in context of sinonasal, it's not a problem. As I told you, people are walking in with gestures in their hand, or it's very easy to do an anterior rhinoscopy. Samples are taken as soon as the patient walks into the ER. Few poor JRs have this thesis, and believe me, they are ready to weep by now, running across our 3 centers, collecting so many samples. But having said that, our bigger problem is the lung. It was always said that once the patient is in ICU, it's easier to get the microbiology, because once a patient has an intubation or tracheostomy, we can enter the lung very easily and we can get direct lower respiratory tract infections or samples. This is a peculiar disease that we are stuck, that we have no access to the lung. Nobody is performing BALs in active COVID, and we are having to take all these co-infection calls on imaging. So, it is an opportunity also, but it's a big responsibility also. But fortunately, in ROCM, diagnosis is not an issue. And in the various slides I showed, I did not speak about it, but you see, the stain itself has a 90% sensitivity. In fact, on culture, only 50% samples will grow it. And on histopath, also about 80% samples will show invasion. Now we come to our core point of imaging and how to report it and how it affects the management. So step-by-step reporting I will discuss. Firstly, even this guideline statement states, and we all know that for invasive fungal sinusitis, that CEMR is the investigation of choice, because obviously you are looking for intracranial involvement. But again, there is a disease where we have, at the peak of mucormycosis about 2 weeks back, we used to have about 10, 12 patients waiting at one time, RT-PCR positive for MR. And it was like a very difficult task to, do so many MRs through the night, through the day. So we had to do a CT. CCT is written as the alternative to CMR in the guideline statement also. But on CCT, the surgeons were fighting with us that when you can't show the ICA, you cannot show the cavernous sinus versus the ICA with confidence. Then what's the point? We still need an MR, and this became a big challenge for us. So we did something that devised a protocol, which I'm going to share with you to solve this problem. In the meanwhile, you will read in some places like trauma has the concept of golden window, which says door to OT in 6 hours. In mucormycosis, in ROCM, it is advocated that door to OT should be 6 hours. It's kind of impossible to achieve, or at least very difficult to achieve in our kind of setting. But we try to keep this as short as possible, so at least from our side, CTs are not delayed and the reports are. So what we use, we started using when 3 weeks or 4 weeks back when we were hit by ROCM and CAM was split bolus. We are very fond of this technique. You may have seen some of this in Smitha's talk. I showed it in my CA larynx talk. And one of our students, Harun, was doing a thesis on this on CA larynx in hemoptysis. We have already published our protocol. It's basically just a protocol adopted out of the TRO and the numerous kidney split bolus single phase settings. And does it work for mucor? It's working for us. You see, what I wanted to bring out was that if you use the split bolus, we do get the cavernous sinus separate from the ICA. So we are able to tell that whether the cavernous sinus is enlarged, thrombosed, and in addition, we are able to tell which segment, how much of ICA is narrowed or thrombosed without losing any information of the paranasal sinus, because we simply reconstruct it into a HR60F mode. So when you use a high kernel, you still get your HR of the PNS. So you see, if you want to show this thrombus and you still want to compare the calibers, you can see there is a narrowing on this side. You want to compare the caliber of the right ICA with the left ICA. So this is our go-to protocol, and this is the only protocol we are using for all CAM patients. And if patient has deranged RFTs, which several of the diabetics will have, then we are choosing a combination of NCCT PNS plus NCMR. And otherwise, we are using this protocol. So this is our protocol. It's very similar to the protocol which we have been showing for carcinoma larynx that we give 2/3 of contrast at 4 ml a second, 30-second gap, and then rest at 3.5 ml. All our published split bolus protocols, including the chest, have been at 1 ml per kg. And every time the reviewers have sent back our papers before they were published, their question was, the Western reviewers, you could not have done it at 1 ml. You have only done it at 1 ml because you are using dual energy scanners. And all our research was on dual energy scanners. So we accepted this point that yes, okay, if you don't have a dual energy scanner, so, maybe you should be using 1.5 ml. But in this case, our COVID scanner during the second wave is not a dual energy scanner. And we used different protocols. We tested about 4 protocols before we came up with this correct dose and the correct interval. We even tried 2 different, like take an arterial and venous separate in a more elderly patients to take 2 phases. This is the best protocol we have hit. And whatever I show you has been done at 1 ml per kg in a non-dual energy scanner, but on a 256 slice. So use of MRI, as I already said, that in non-COVID times, negative patients, it is the modality of choice, but we are using it in deranged RFTs. We are using it when the CT doesn't come out well, and there are some questions of the intracranial part we are not able to answer, and we also will be using it for follow-up imaging. And this was about which modality to use. Now, how to report. The report comprises of 2 parts, which is diagnosis, and second is mapping extent. The 2 are somewhat similar. As I said, that the diagnosis of invasive fungal sinusitis rests on the question of showing invasion. So step number 1, according to me, of the diagnosis is it invasive fungal sinusitis? Means whatever you see in the PNS, does it reflect IFS or AIFR? Differentiating it from other forms of sinusitis, even people have inflammatory polyps, pre-existing tumors. Second question is it mucormycosis? So we have to answer both these questions. This is a very good review. Another one that I will be showing you stuff from as we go along in pre-COVID era, 2015. And what it said actually was that the 7 sites, I will discuss these various sites of invasion, that even the guideline statement says that, a negative CT has a very high predictive value. Means it has a high PPV and has a high NPV also. Means if you don't see any mucosal thickening on CT, you don't have CAM. And if you don't see invasion, you don't have invasive CAM. You may still have CAM, but in its early stage. So CT has a very high positive predictive, 100% specificity, 100% PPV. And as I said, the guideline statement also says a very high NPV. This is a review that we have published. We had written it like a year back, and where everybody thought that, it came back from several journals, landed up in PGR, and which has been, published in this issue. And we are very grateful to them because this is so topical now. We spoke about various forms of skull-based osteomyelitis, including AIFR-associated osteomyelitis in this article. So it does speak about differentiation of aspergillus versus mucor. For example, everybody would agree this is an invasive fungal sinusitis. It is obvious that there's a orbital invasion, there's a sequestrum in the maxilla. If I were to ask you aspergillus or mucor, so this now in hindsight I know and is a proven patient of aspergillus. We have not seen, some degree of time I feel is required even for the sequestrum to form, while in mucor now in CAM, we have been seeing a lot of permeative kind of destruction. This is again from our own article. So, but not these kind of sequestra. Yeah, the sequestra have been seen more in the aspergillus group. So when is it mucor versus aspergillus? When it is invasive fungal. I already brought it out, any site. So T2 hypointensity again is common to both of them, which is related to the presence of iron and manganese. In this context, when desferoxamine used to be used in hemodialysis patients earlier, there was a high incidence of mucormycosis reported, pulmonary mucormycosis. You see, mucor is a gobbler of iron. It concentrates iron. So that is why you get this dark on the T2. So there is a lot of talk of relationship in pathophysiology of iron and mucormycosis. So it's not just a sign, it explains a lot of pathogenesis and pathology of this disease. Black turbinate sign, you remember that it reflects the small vessel invasion. So you get the ischemia, which results in non-enhancement on a CMR. So this is the article from the original article which described the black turbinate sign, which is in 2010, which is because of the small vessel ischemia, this turbinate looks non-enhancing compared to the contralateral side. This is from our article this is pre-CAM era, but whatever, it was a structured review. So we have tabulated, taken out stats on a whole lot of published articles of Aspergillus and mucor. And this is following the comparison of the stats, the final algorithm which we give, that, the immune suppression is so vital for the mucor. The progression is far more rapid. Black eschar is not seen in Aspergillus. The treatment of choice in terms of drug is different. Orbital exenteration is essential. Surgical intervention, you may get away without it in Aspergillus, but you will not get away without it in mucor. And this is again Aspergillus and mucor. The black turbinate sign is again characteristic to mucor, and the incidence of orbital and intracranial involvement is far more in mucor, although the pulmonary involvement is seen more in Aspergillus. So this is again from our article, one patient of Aspergillus. As I show you the mucor cases more, you will see that, we are not getting these large masses in mucor. There is no time for such large masses to form, for sclerosis to form, for sequestrum to form. All that, including perineural spread, is more in favor of Aspergillus. Now, this is one of our mucor patients. And as I go along with the staging, I will cover with you the key areas which need to be reported. And as I said, see, there's no sequestrum, there is invasion, there's an abscess in the orbit, but there is no sequestrum, there is no sclerosis here. Nasal septum is gone, the disease is across. This is the NG tube, so disregard that. Okay, so now we come to a structured reporting format which we have devised based on the staging format which has been given in the guideline statement. So this is from the guideline statement which says, now we will come to different sites. First, the nasal mucosa. As it runs through the stages A to D, see the first and see the last. What's the earliest to get hit? The middle turbinate. Remember, it's not the inferior turbinate. There are some diseases such as rhinosporidosis, wherein the spores come in and characteristically hit the IR first, the inferior turbinate first. But this disease hits the middle turbinate first. So involvement of middle turbinate is taken as 1A, but involvement of inferior turbinate is taken as 1B. So middle turbinate is the first one to take the hit. Subsequently, it goes on to the inferior turbinate and maxillary sinus ostium, eventually bilateral, and bilaterality puts it at its highest grade. So as you will see in all the cases I show you and the cases you must be seeing every day once you observe that this is the area middle turbinate ostium which takes the hit the first. So this is stage 1, which means that the disease involves the nasal mucosa. Okay. This patient is not stage 1, but again to emphasize the middle turbinate point. This is the mucor, this is the retained secretions. Stage 2 is spread to the paranasal sinuses. Yeah, again, paranasal sinuses, the spread is easy to understand, 1 sinus or 2 sinus. And eventually, when it goes laterally beyond sinus into zygoma and mandible, you will say, why mandible? I'll show you how later in same case as we go along by mandible. So these are the stages of paranasal involvement. So unilaterality, bilaterality being the main this thing, and then if it goes and involves the bone. Now we come to the orbit, which, as I told you, very important determinant of management. What's the first area to take the hit? It's the NLD and the medial orbit. See, medial orbit, we are all familiar because lamina papyracea takes a hit earlier. And so medial orbit, but also the NLD. If the NLD is involved, obviously the IR is involved because it drains into the IR, inferior turbinate. So once the inferior turbinate gets involved, the NLD gets involved. And NLD involvement with non-affected vision remains the stage 3A. One question when the surgeons have been after us to answer, and they kept saying that you will have to do a CMR because you need to tell us that whether a CRO is present or CRVO is present or not. So central retinal artery occlusion and central retinal vein occlusion is what pushes this orbital involvement to 3C. But what I said is that we would have to do an angio, MR angio in all, and then also I'm not sure how confidently we'll be able to diagnose CRO. And obviously the examination times go up for every patient, and with so many patients waiting in ER. So did these people write about this occlusion based on imaging? No, the diagnosis of CRO and arterial and venous occlusion is actually dependent on the fundoscopic examination, because like with any venous occlusion, you will get hemorrhage, edema. With arterial occlusion, you will get a white pale disc. So doing a fundus in the ER itself of this patient are very critical, because renal, arterial and venous occlusion are going to place it, say, immediately into 3C. And bilaterality will be D. Now, let me show you this same abscess that I was referring to. So this is again septum gone. Did this come through direct invasion from the lamina papyracea, or is this the dilated lacrimal sac which is happening because of NLD obstruction? Both mechanisms are possible. Also remember that to show spread from ethmoid to orbit, it is not always necessary to be able to demonstrate the bone erosion, because there is spread of disease through the perivenular and periarterial gaps also, along the nerves, along the veins, along the inferior ophthalmic. It will go and it can spread. So it's not necessary. So if you see superior ophthalmic vein, we can see, but central retinal artery and central retinal vein resolution is, because their sizes are really small. I'm very familiar with it on DSA. But I'm not sure, I have not reported CRV on MR because I've not done MR dual phase kind of angios in these patients. So this is primarily a fundoscopy call. Then after that, as I said, you will talk about the extraocular muscles, the retroorbital fat, the orbital apex, inferior orbital fissure, superior orbital fissure, because eventually this is the route that it is going to reach the cavernous sinus. So orbital invasion, to summarize, MR is the earliest sign. Other extraocular muscles, retroorbital fat, Cree areas, bone erosions, and advanced sign is optic nerve stretching due to edema and tenting of posterior globe, because you see eventually the vision loss starts to happen when this involvement occurs. Before that, you only have diplopia, proptosis, such things. Lastly, we come to the intracranial involvement. Intracranial involvement also has several components from A to D. The earliest sign is focal or partial cavernous sinus thrombosis or focal cribriform plate involvement. As this gets diffused, it goes to B. As it goes beyond cavernous sinus, so ICA occlusion immediately takes you to C, and D is multifocal diffuse CNS disease, and I'll show you how it reflects the management. So, the other, from a clinical point of view, all these nerves get affected when cavernous sinus. An important point they write is that if bilateral signs are present with no clinical or radiological evidence of paranasal or orbital involvement, it still indicates a cavernous sinus thrombosis. So these two have to always run in conjunction to give the final stage. So cavernous sinus thrombosis, as yet, you see, again, if you will see carefully, in most of the patients, you will find a narrowing of the caliber of the ICA. And when you do the MR angio, you find this is the TOF and the NC, which we are doing in the patients with the deranged RFTs. And of course, the TOF will also show up once the ICA itself is thrombosed and patient had infarcts in the hyparietal region. The one invasion which has not been accounted for in the staging system but has been emphasized a lot in the 2015 AJNR article is the perisinus invasion. One, it goes into the cheek. You see the cheek on this side goes into the cheek. And more importantly, it goes into the retroantral space here, goes into the pterygopalatine fossa, involves the sphenopalatine foramen. This is how the mandible gets involved, because what is this structure you are seeing? This is the coronoid process. So you compare the two sides, how nicely you can see the muscles of mastication, and see on this side, these have got so fuzzy, you can't see the bone invasion, but of course you'll check on a bone window, and when you do, you invariably find focal invasion. This has a very cellulitis kind of loop, and this is how the coronoid process gets involved, and then it spreads into the mandible. The maxilla, of course, gets involved directly. See the pre-sinus involvement plus retrosinus involvement. And once the pterygopalatine fossa is involved, it becomes another route for spread to the cavernous sinus. Now the medial pterygoid involvement on the contralateral side is obvious. So this is similar, showing again that how the pterygopalatine fossa, sphenopalatine foramen get involved in this disease, which leads to the spread into the retroantral tissue, which is very critical, because now we have started also emphasizing to the surgeons. So wherever we report retroantral clearance is also done. Usually they are doing a FES, so they will go and try and do some retro, and we are sending all these samples for histopathology. And once we finish with the wave and we analyze our results, we will get a sense of did we pick up mucor here or not. So the 7 sites of this 2015 article, which were very critical in mucor, were periantral fat, presence of bone, dehiscence, orbit, palate, pterygopalatine fossa, NLD, and lacrimal fossa. I'm not going to go back to the sides. I meant to show you the palate erosion in one of those images, but you are aware of this. And so palate is one of the sites. This is the checklist of everything that you need to see from the same article. It tells you the specificity and sensitivity of being able to say whether it's mucor. See how high the NLD goes. NLD and lacrimal sac are pretty specific areas of involvement. So this is our reporting template in the end, how based on the staging. So we do divide it into a mucosal disease, which is divided into sinus and PNS. And then we talk about invasion. We first talk of the perisinus invasion, skull base. We divide the orbit invasion into various parts. It's all a plus minus structured reporting format. And it's not that, the residents were not cribbing for a while, but we had no option, because how else to communicate to the surgeon. And the hard palate, as you can see, nasal septum, everything is accounted for. And similarly in the ICA, we wrote all the segments, because yes, on the split bolus, we can see all the segments well. So we do comment on all the segments. We comment on dura, brain parenchyma, etc. Some of the examples, brain, etc., I may have forgotten to show you, but you've seen them too. So basically, this is how we need to report. The conclusion has to say rhinosinusitis with no evidence of invasion or with evidence of invasion, and mention these specific sites. And rest of the detail would have come into the into the report. I had put some nice MIP images to show you how nicely those arteries show up. Maybe in cutting down the number already we are out of time, so it went down. Lastly, I will show this slide of management. Yeah. See, on every patient, you need antifungal with amphotericin B. Liposomal is the drug of choice. As you know that we are not only facing shortages of amphotericin, liposomal is like, what should I say, liquid gold now. And there is a big debate on angisome, fungisomes, which you may have followed, that, the Indian variant is a fat-based lyophilized amphotericin, which actually for mucor, we need the liposomal, but currently even the lyophilized is like liquid gold. So, we are working, let's say, operating with one hand tied, but whatever best, as the numbers go down, the availability will also improve, but currently it's a challenge. So according to stage, it tells you that, you have to do a debridement. You begin with PNS and you go for a turbinectomy, palatal resection, medial wall resection. And then as the, stage goes beyond 3, then we go in, you go in for an orbital exentration. When it goes on to an extensive orbital involvement, even exentration is not going to work. and you still do an orbital excenteration and aggressive debridement, palatal resection, orbital wall resection, but eventually, you may have some patients stages 4C to do, which like oncology, it kind of, if you cannot operate, it's kind of impossible that these patients are going to respond, and it's like a palliative treatment. But so we do want clearance. You do need surgical clearance. And in addition, you need ampho or posaconazole or isavuconazole, which is the third drug of choice, and intravenous. This is a very brief statement, which was not in that much detail because it was meant like a single slide recommendation. So I picked the recommendation with more detail because it had radiology. All clinical statements leave it up to you to do CT or MR. So I've already told you what we have chosen. This for follow-up, we will be doing MR. This is again from our PGR article. As you can see, post-exenteration patient, endpoint of treatment and residual disease is another challenge in these patients to be discussed on another day. I have showed this slide throughout this pandemic, but I think I will change it to this. I'm not sure when it will pass, but have we come out stronger and wiser from this? Perhaps we have, although this was not a good way to learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ashu, for that most brilliant